Hey, welcome back everybody. Today I got something really cool for you. So this is a GMC 305 cubic inch 60 degree V6. Now these engines are pretty amazing, and I picked this up today. I found it for sale, and I've been wanting to do one of these for a while. And so I want to give you a little bit of background on it because I am going to do a video series and a build on these. So a little history about the this little GM V6, or I shouldn't say little GM V6, this GM V6. This engine was produced from 1959, and believe it or not, they made it all the way through 1974. And there was several versions of it. Now this one here is a 305 cubic inch V6, and the 305 V6 has a 4.250 bore, 4 1/4 inch bore, and a 3.580 stroke. So it has basically the same bore as a 454, and the stroke is a little bit longer than like a 350 Chevy. So that was the 305 version of it. They also had a 350 cubic inch, 351 cubic inch V6, which was a 5.8 liter, and that one had a 4.560 bore, 4.5 inches, a little more than 4.5 inches, which is basically the same bore as like a 502 big block. And it also had the same stroke, 3.580, as they just made it's basically a 305 with a bigger bore. They made the bore size bigger. Then they had a 379 cubic inch version of that motor. Oh, and by the way, the horsepower and torque rating on the 305 was 165 horsepower, which doesn't seem like a lot. But really it was kind of a torque engine. It had 280 foot-pounds of torque, and it was at a fairly low RPM. It had 280 foot-pounds of torque at like 2,200 RPMs or something like that. And that was the 305. The 351 had like 180 horsepower, and it had like 200, and it didn't have it had 266 foot-pounds of torque, believe it or not, a little less. So I'm not sure what that was all about. The 379 cubic inch version of this motor had a 4-inch 562 bore, which is more than 4.5 inches. It had a 3.860 stroke, so more than 3 3/4 inch stroke. And then they also had a 401. The 401 was a real powerhouse. That thing it was a 6.6 liter, but they called it a 401, and it had a 4-inch 870 bore. So it's like 4 3/4 inch bore with a 3.580 stroke. And that thing had quite a bit of horsepower. If you compare it to the other ones, it had about 265 horsepower, and the torque was somewhere in the 350-ish range, which is not, for the late 1950s and 60s, that was pretty good for a truck. And then they also had a V8 engine, which was a 7.8 liter. Oh no, I'm sorry. The V8 was 10.4 liters. It was 637 cubic inches. It was actually the biggest production gasoline V8 that they ever made for trucks. So the V8 engine was pretty substantial in its horsepower and torque. I didn't really find a lot of information on that motor because it wasn't real popular, and they only made a very small number of those. The biggest 6-cylinder they made, the biggest version of this that was a 6-cylinder, was 478 cubic inches. So, I mean, we think about a 454 Chevy, but it's a V8. This is a V6. They're 6 cylinders, and they had 478 cubic inches. That thing was a monster. It was literally the biggest V6 engine ever produced. Now there's been other, I'm sure, 6 cylinders in diesel versions of 6s that were bigger, but As far as gasoline engine goes, that 478. It was a 7.8 liter engine, and it was a V6. And that thing had, God, what did I read about it? It had 255 horsepower, and the torque was like 442. So, yeah, for like the 1960s trucks, that was pretty good. So, but here's where the story gets really crazy with this motor. They also have a V12 version of this motor. A lot of people don't know about this, but it was 702 cubic inches. And basically what they did is they took two of the 351s, right? We talked about that 351 V6, which is one step up from the 305. So it's basically a 305 with a bigger bore. So they took two of the 351 versions, or it was the same bore size and stroke as the 351, which was 4.560 bore and a 3.580 stroke. So 4.5 inch bore and a little more than 3.5 inch stroke. They put two of those together, but what it was is it wasn't really two of these like bolted together. It had one common block. So they literally took this block design and they made a 12-cylinder version of it, and they made one long crankshaft. So it had a common block and it had a common crankshaft, but it had two sets of cylinder heads on it. It literally had very similar cylinder heads like this, but there was a set here and then there was another set here. So imagine this engine, you know, twice as long as this with 12 cylinders, 700 cubic inches. It had it was crazy because it had separate heads, and it actually had 4 sets of these manifolds on here. So it had manifold here, manifold on the other side, and then 2 more sets and 2 more heads, and it had 4 valve covers. It's crazy what they did back then. But that thing was, I mean, we talk about big engines. That was, for gasoline engines, that thing was an absolute monster as far as production engines go. It only had 250 horsepower. You know, and it was a low RPM, low compression deal, but it had 585 foot-pounds of torque, which was a real torque monster. And this thing was in like C60 trucks, the big, large motor coaches and trucks that GM made. It was an industrial engine. One of the things that I noticed about this guy is it's just a really big, heavy-duty motor. I mean, the front cover up here, and I'll kind of try to do a walk around, but this big cast iron piece, this is literally the water goes in through here. The pump is just bolted to the front of it, but this is where the water gets into the engine. So this whole piece here, it goes all the way down, and this is literally the front cover of the engine. It goes down around the harmonic balancer, it comes down, and the pan bolts into it down here. But this is just one big cast iron piece on the front of the motor. I think this front is a timing chain cover, and it has the water ports and stuff. This front cover is solid cast iron. I think this cover weighs about as much as a small block Chevy head. It also has if you take a look at this, it has the provision for the mechanical pump, and there's an eccentric that bolts to the front of the cam, and then the pump arm goes in. So this was the mechanical pump. And we'll when I do the teardown, I'm going to do a complete build and teardown on this for you guys. We'll get that off, and we'll be able to see all that. The intake manifold is, of course, a cast iron piece, and it just bolts to the top of the motor. What's a little bit interesting about this motor and unique is that now normally on like Chevrolets you would have the spark plug wires and so forth out here by the manifold. What's kind of cool about this is they got those spark plugs. The spark plugs are actually inboard. They're in here kind of where the intake manifold bolts up. So the plugs are right up here on top. We don't have to worry about the wires getting burnt up with these manifolds. Man, I'll tell you, that is a really good design. I wish a lot of the V8s and stuff we worked on had the spark plugs up here instead of out on the outside. But I mean, I don't know how well that would work out for the efficiency of the chambers and so forth, but I really like where those spark plugs are located. If you go back here, you can see now this one has the bell housing bolted to it. This is actually the crankcase breather, and it presses into the block. In the old days, we didn't have breathers that went into the PCV valves and stuff. It has, this is the oil filter, which is the old canister type, and it has this big heavy duty oil filter canister attachment here with the sending unit on it. So that's all made out of cast iron. This thing's really heavy. As we go around the back, you can see that we still have the bell housing on this thing. And of course it had a hydraulic clutch, a lot of them did. This is the back of the camshaft. There's a plug in here and the camshaft rides down the center of the motor, and then of course the distributor. And there is the intake manifold is basically just bolted to the heads, and then down in here there's a valley pan. There's a narrow valley pan that covers up the cam, so you can get that off to access the cam and the lifters. And then of course it has these big heavy duty motor mounts in it. I'm going to run this engine once I get it running and rebuilt. I'm going to go ahead and fire this up because I can't resist it. So that'll be part of the build on this, is actually firing this thing up. It had an old points distributor on it. I don't know if we're going to use that or not. I'm not sure if there's anything to replace it. What's kind of cool about this is it has a little window up here on this. I don't know if some of you might not even know what this is, but what this is this is a little window that you can open up, and there's an Allen head in there, and you can set the dwell on your points because it's a points distributor, which, you know, the points distributors were kind of junky, but so should be an interesting build. This is these things are, man, when I loaded this thing up and brought it home today, it was, I mean, we loaded this, the guy literally loaded this thing on the back of my truck with a forklift. And I've got that half-ton Dodge Ram I took out there, and when we loaded this onto the back, I'll tell you what, this engine is heavy. This is a heavy-duty sucker. Now, when GM first produced these, one of the marketing mantras that they had with this engine was that it was a heavy-duty truck motor. It weighs more than this version, the V6, weighs more than a big block Chevy. You know, and I'm not saying that weight's a good thing, but it was just a really heavy-duty truck casting. I mean, this thing is it is durable. They touted this as being a 500,000-mile motor. So, and that's been proven out over the years that you literally can get 500,000 miles or more out of this engine, and it was just an absolute brute. This thing was built to be heavy and strong and brutal and pull a lot of weight. It has a big, thick, heavy crankshaft. Just really, you know, my channel name is My Vintage Iron. Well, this is my vintage iron. This thing is solid. So it was just a really solid, heavy duty. And they actually, you could buy pickup trucks with this engine, with the 305 and I believe the 351. They actually had GMC pickup trucks that you could buy that had this motor in it. And boy, I tell you, they just ran forever. So we're going to get into this. I'm going to tear this down, and I'll walk you guys through the tear down. I hope you're excited about it because there's a whole following of people out there. They have clubs, right, that specifically have these V6 engines, and then just you know, they get together and have truck shows and stuff. So this motor has kind of a cult following, so I thought it would be kind of cool. I picked it up for a pretty reasonable price, and this is going to be our next project. I also got an extra transmission with it. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with that. Oh, and another thing that I wanted to mention here is that these engines, some of these builds, now a lot of the builds that I do are for customers. You know, it's customer stuff, and I like, well, you know, I'm going to make a video out of this because I got the motor, we might as well do it. Some of the engines that I'm doing now are going to be for sale. Once I go through the build, and that goes for this one here. Once I get the build done on this engine, I'm actually this engine's going to be for sale. So if there's any of you viewers out there that you're interested in this engine, this will be available for you to purchase. Not only will you get a good quality engine, something that's rare and kind of cool, but you'll actually have a permanent record, YouTube video record of that engine being assembled step by step. So I thought that would that you know, that's a little bit of an extra for you. So yeah, keep in mind this is going to be up for sale when I get it done. So stay tuned, because I've got this. This is now, if you guys are waiting for the 351 modified, that's coming up. If you're waiting for the 502 Chevy, that's coming up. I know you promised that. I promised you that, but I'm just one guy. You know, I can only do so much. So I'll get to the teardown here. It is actually Christmas Day, so I don't know. This video probably won't be posted until sometime later in the week. But I hope you all had a great Christmas, and I hope you're enjoying this. If you have any comments or requests, you know, I'm getting a bunch of people wanting me to do like small block 400. I get that a lot. Should do a Chevy small block 400. Well, yeah, I can do that, but quite honestly, the small block 400 is not really much different than a 350 as far as the build goes. It's like very, very similar. There's only minor differences. So anyway, subscribe. Ask any questions or comments that you may have, and I'll do my best to answer them. And I'm jazzed about this one. This is actually, I'm more jazzed about this build than I have been about a build I've done for a long time. I mean, this is something I have always wanted to do one of these. At one time, I had a couple sets of heads laying around here for one of these, and I thought, man, those things are gigantic. It's just this big, heavy, giant 6-cylinder head. And they have mechanical cams in them, you know, and it's really cool stuff. And this one actually came with a flywheel and a bell housing, so that's going to make it really easy to, you know, mount this on my engine stand, my run stand. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you had a Merry Christmas, and I will talk to you soon, I promise. Thanks for watching. These V6 engines were actually... Edit.
Hey everybody, I hope you're enjoying the video. We're going to build an engine today. Stay tuned and make sure you subscribe.
I can't put that on there.